Thank you, Dr. Sharp. I think that was really helpful to hear both about your firsthand perspective as a lab director and also to dive into the CLIA expectations and requirements. And I see that we have a question from Samir about a delegation of a specific duty. Perhaps Dr. Sharp can answer that while I'm presenting, or maybe can address that at the end. And feel free to, like Alex said, put your questions there so that we can either address them during the course of this or at the end, either one. I'm going to start by giving a broad overview of what CLIA expects in terms of the qualifications of a laboratory director. And this is very broad, like Dr. Sharp mentioned. There are some specific requirements by states, by accrediting body, but this is in general what CLIA is requiring of the qualifications for a laboratory director. So in general here, I've thrown up on the slides the differences in qualifications between a high complexity laboratory director and a moderate complexity laboratory director. Generally speaking, a high complexity laboratory director has a doctoral degree, so PhD, an MD, a DO, or a DPM, plus a board certification. And of course, if that lab director is an MD, a DO, or a DPM, that person would also need a medical license for the state in which the lab is located. And you can see for the differences there in moderate complexity requirements in that it's more about education plus appropriate experience supervising non-wave testing. That combination will qualify someone to be a laboratory director of a moderate complexity lab. There are also some differences in terms of requirements for different accrediting bodies, such as COLA and CAP, like Dr. Sharp mentioned, as well as other agencies like SAMHSA, Joint Commission, and things like that. And some of the states that have specific requirements include New York, Tennessee, California, etc. How have these qualification requirements changed in recent years? One of the big differences that has changed in terms of what CLIA requires of a qualified laboratory director, and I'm speaking in terms of a high complexity qualified lab director here, is a board certification. A board certification wasn't originally required when CLIA first came about and put out the requirements for a laboratory director, but it is something that they do require now of all high complexity qualified lab directors. Some of you may be familiar with what we used to call grandfathered in status. And what that was someone who had a doctoral degree and was recognized for having experience enough to direct a lab or for qualifying as a lab director prior to a certain date. And unfortunately, both CLIA and COLA are no longer recognizing new lab director affiliations for lab directors that are grandfathered in. And basically what that means is that they don't hold a board certification. There's no impact to lab directors who are grandfathered in, so those who lack a board certification, with the labs that they are already affiliated with. So if you yourself are a lab director who lacks a board certification and are grandfathered in as a result, so long as you maintain your affiliation as the CLIA lab director for that lab, there's no issue. They're not going to say you can no longer direct this lab or anything, at least at this point. However, as of last year, both CLIA and COLA began essentially denying lab directors that would have previously been categorized as grandfathered in and who lack that board certification to be approved as a lab director of a high complexity lab. And I actually communicated with some people at both some of the CLIA offices and COLA representatives to ask about this change and to clarify that change as it was happening last year. And basically what I was told was that it's never really meant to be a long-term solution. Once they decided that board certification was necessary, that's the way that they wanted to move toward in terms of the qualifications required of a lab director. And so last year they came to the conclusion that it was time to do away with the grandfathered status. And so they are no longer recognizing new affiliations, like I said, with grandfathered lab directors and labs. Essentially, what this has turned into is that, labs are required more stringently to have a lab director with certain qualifications. And we are also seeing that training programs of lab directors are becoming more and more specialized. Like Dr. Sharp mentioned, given her background in toxicology and she doesn't have a lot of infectious disease experience, she wants to ensure that the other staff members in her labs that do that kind of testing have a strong background. And so we're seeing a lot of the training programs for even these higher level positions, like high level scientists and lab directors, becoming more and more specialized to where they're focusing on one particular area. And that might be infectious disease, that might be toxicology, that might be something totally different, but they are becoming more and more specialized. So this leads us to our conclusion that, the requirements are both more stringent, the training programs are becoming more specialized, and so we may need to take a special approach to hiring a lab director. And the first thing that you want to consider when you are deciding to hire a lab director or a new lab director is your part-time versus full-time need. This is very important for a lab because there's a large overhead cost for hiring a full-time lab director. And oftentimes, like Dr. Sharp mentioned, a part-time lab director who's mostly remote can meet the needs that you have. As she detailed, there are some differences in terms of lab director execution. There are delegated duties when the lab director is part-time or remote, and they have obviously lesser involvement with the lab. In my experience, I think that most small to moderately sized laboratories benefit well from a part-time lab director. But if you are looking for a more hands-on, boots on the ground, business-minded leader of your laboratory to help launch you into the next stages of your facility, to grow it and to stay on the cutting edge of new technologies, new testing, your laboratory is probably going to better benefit from a full-time lab director.